Great. So first of all, to thank Gail Lowe and Kirsty Gunn for establishing Imagine Space and suggesting this event in their spirit of what they call a creative studio ethos, where thinking intersects with writing practice, and today, obviously, with artistic practice too. So many thanks to Gail and Kirsty for this space and for inviting us into this space. I know that Gail can contact you about future Imagine Space events through your participation in this event. If you'd like not to be contacted, please just put a little note in the chat to say, please keep me off the list. So this is really a perfect invitation for a conversation with Annalee Davis, whose practice genuinely sits meaningfully at the intersection of critical and creative awareness, as well as critical and creative brilliance. So the plan for the next sort of 60 to 90 minutes is that I'll introduce Annalee briefly and say a tiny bit about the context of the work that she'll be discussing. And then we'll have a Q&A. So please do, we're hoping to have a kind of conversation. So please do keep a note of any questions that you have. So to introduce Annalee is a visual artist, a cultural activist, an instigator, an educator, and a writer. So she works at the intersection of biography and history, focusing on post-plantation economies by engaging with a particular landscape on Barbados. So I have been fortunate enough to visit her studio a few times, which is sited in this landscape, and her practice kind of determinedly engages with the history of that landscape. And there was a sugar plantation established there in 1667. So it's a very long and disturbing history that she engages with. It was also in this same space that Annalee launched Fresh Milk, which is an art platform and micro-residency program established since 2011, which I know has been immensely energizing for artistic activity and dialogue in Barbados and also across the Caribbean region. So it's very much in her spirit that her work looks outwards and reaches outwards and is in conversation with others. I think at heart, Annalee's work's centrally engaged with thinking through what is the role of arts and the artist in a place that's both steeped in colonial history and also complicit in neo-colonial economies of tourism. So her work engages with plantations' residue, often very material forms, and through the landscape that colonialism irrevocably altered and the continued impact on the contemporary environment. And it begins to help us. She talks about drawing new lines. You can see the lines on her wall there behind her, which are the topology of the plantation. But she talks about drawing new lines and insisting on the possibility of new lines being drawn within that situation. And her work begins to imagine how to form more intimate relationships with landscape. So it's often very intricate, very intimate work, and thinking about how a landscape that feels so overdetermined by that big history of sugar and tourism can be thought about through different lines. So through her drawing, embroidery, making teas, growing gardens, she really is engaged in this kind of reparative and restorative practice, thinking about, how the present can respond to the past, thinking about different futures. So today, Annalee is going to be sharing and discussing the work that she produced as part of a year-long commission for the National Trust of Scotland, which explores historic links between Scotland and Barbados. And it's important really to understand that that work is itself part of a wider commitment on the part of the National Trust for Scotland to research and make visible the legacies of slavery in Scotland, a work called Facing Our Past. At the time that project began in September 2020, there was an awareness that around 20 properties in Scotland had connections to slavery. In just over a year, that number had more than doubled to, I think, 49. So that gives you a real sense both of the density of the connections between the Caribbean and Scotland, and also how much of that history can be surfaced when we choose to look for it and at it. And I would say, if you're interested in that wider context, the National Library of Scotland has some really good resources, including videos. If some of you are educators out there, some very accessible material. So the ongoing work, I think, also points, that the bigger framework for Annalee's work points to that wider project of enacting social justice through knowledge creation and artistic creation, which brings us, nicely to her own work. So Annalee has named her involvement with Facing the Past under the rather elegant and intriguing title, Contesting Landscapes of Distraction, focusing on the entangled ties between Barbados and Scotland. So I thought it might help for those of you who don't know much about it, just to give you a very brief sense of the complicated and often hidden nature of those entanglements. And this is a sort of typical academic own goal, that I went and refreshed my knowledge of this, and then went to Annalee's blog and found it was all there beautifully written down. So if you want to know more, then please go to Annalee's Contesting Landscapes of Distraction. But just to give you a sense of the kind of differently positioned relations in that history, some of the Scots were very implicit in the colonial project. They owned plantations and used the money, the profits from enslavement and from plantation cash crops to buy huge tracts of land in Scotland. So some of Scottish landowners actually benefited from plantations. Some Scots, on the other hand, were what's called Barbadoed. So they were exiled to Barbados following the 1745 Jacobite uprising. And in fact, some of the landowners who benefited from the Caribbean were also the same landowners involved in those exiles. And then obviously we have a few significant individuals whose lives are very available to the historical record, typically rich white men, who help us track the way in which slavery has been concealed within Scottish histories. So somebody like Francis Humbleston Mackenzie, also known as Lord Seaforth, who was the governor of Barbados from 1801 to 1806. And he, in order to maintain his highland properties, he bought plantations in Guyana and was involved in the enslavement of people on those plantations. So that kind of gives you a sense of the way in which the Scottish both were mainly, I guess, profiteers of slavery, but also some caught up as unfree labor also on those, not enslaved, but unfree in the sense of being indentured or exiled without land or property. So Annalee's engagement with those histories in Contesting Landscapes of Distraction has been particularly focused on the fact that, as we know it quite often, the transatlantic slave trade, because it was a triangular trade, managed to conceal from the UK the nature of the trade in human lives that was going on between Africa and the Caribbean. And she's been particularly interested in the histories of the powerless across Barbados and Scotland, those connected histories too. So I'm just quoting here a little bit from her. I'm interested in the historic practice of spiriting away, kidnapping children, homeless people, women working in brothels, prisoners and others shipped off against their will from Britain to Barbados to work as indentured labourers on sugar plantations. Their invisibility as poor men, women and children was mirrored in Barbadian society, given scant information about their lives marked by early deaths and impoverishment. Exploring these buried histories and the potential relationship between the erasure of villages and eviction of crofters and cotters during the clearances and vanishing villages in the Scotland district in Barbados's Atlantic coast due to land slippage and loss of indentured labourers' homes on less productive soils provides an opportunity to draw multiple lines across imperial economies enforced in two territories reshaped by transplantation and displacement. So before I invite Annalee to spend about half an hour talking us through this extraordinary box of set of prints produced in collaboration with the Dundee Contemporary Arts, which was shown last year in her solo exhibition, A Hymn to the Banished, which was that exhibition was on in September and October at the Steddings Gallery in Balmacara, and will be shown again in the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh in January 2024. But before we go into that, I'd just like to invite her to talk to us about that wider phrasing for the Commission, contesting landscapes of distraction, and how that phrase kind of captures something about those that entanglement at the heart of this work. So I'm going to stop here and invite Annalee to talk to us.
Thank you so much for that thorough introduction, Alison, and of course to Gail and Kirsty for the invitation to be part of Imagine Spaces. So when I was invited by the National Trust to put forward a proposal for their Facing Our Past program, I gave it the collective title, Contesting Landscapes of Distraction, because the link that was made to Balmacara Estate, which was obvious because of his connection to Barbados, he was also Lord Seaforth, or Humberston Mackenzie, as you mentioned, was referred to as the botanical governor. He was an amateur botanist, and he was one of the first people to move plant material from the West Indies to Kew and to other gardens across Britain. And the focus really in the archive has been on him and these large kind of palatial gardens and mansions that were built on the back of the transatlantic slave trade and the sugarcane plantation project. And I see them as these landscapes of distraction, because it seems from the year that I've spent going back and forth to Scotland, there wasn't a lot of knowledge by average people about this connection. And I was more interested in looking at the impact of these large tracts of land that were being bought and made to have them look as though they were civilized, moral, upstanding people in society. And what really was in the wake of that acquisition of land was exile, which led to the clearances at some point, and that connection to the kind of darker history and their relationship to slavery. So I see those large, beautiful estates and gardens really as distraction from a lot of the darker stories underneath, and that was where that came from. Gail, maybe I don't know if you've enabled me as the host already. Okay. Okay, so I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. Just a thumbs up, Alison. Okay, great. While I was in Scotland, I learned this word dúchas, and so I will speak to it as I go through the presentation. And what I'm going to do is share my process, my thinking and working process, the body of work that came out of the commission. And then if we have time, I'll share two more recent projects that are connected in some way. Just to be able to show you where I'm located. For those of you who are not aware, I'm on the small island of Barbados, which is the most easterly island in the necklace of the Caribbean archipelago. It's the only island in the Caribbean that was colonized by one colonial power, the British, from the beginning until independence in the 60s. Oh, sorry, there's something strange going on here, so just give me a minute. Okay, I'm particularly interested for the in the context of this commission in the Scotland district in Barbados. Alison had mentioned in the introduction that some of the indentured labourers would have been exiled to this part of the island after their period of contract labour It's an unusual part of the island. It has a lot of clay in the soil. And these narratives around vanishing villages were very interesting to me. The archives, of course, are deficient and don't have a lot of information about working people. But we do know that some of the villages that indentured people were kind of moved onto after their period of contract labor. Entire villages would just disappear because of land slippage. And I was interested in that notion of vanishing villages and this idea of being spirited away and the picking up of people off the street in Great Britain and sending them on ships across to the Caribbean. So looking at this, the gaps in the archive, this idea around invisibility. It's a weird, something is very odd in this interface, so I'm apologizing for that. I live on a dairy farm, and this is the milking parlor, and my paternal grandfather who was here. When we were children, I thought this was very unique to Barbados. My grandparents used to give me and my siblings and my cousin a small glass of sugar and rum, believe it or not. And we would come out to the milking parlor and put our glass under the udder and have hot milk into our cups, and it was called a bub. And I thought this was very unique to Barbados. But when I was in Scotland last year, I came across a paper called Grandmother's Cures for Grandfather's Ills. There's a lot of amazing documentation there, and came across, this is such a strange interface. I don't have control. I'm really sorry about this. This has never happened to me before. Okay, so I came across this recipe for using whiskey as a tonic mixed with milk from the cow as a way to dispel the common cold or cough. And it made me think in a kind of a superficial way about these kinds of connections. You know, did that recipe that my grandparents have maybe come in from Scotland? And then, of course, there are these other connections that we have, which we are very aware of here in the Caribbean of our colonial history. There's an annual Celtic festival where musicians come in from Scotland, some from the Highlands, and they play with Barbadian bands, the police band. On the right is a Barbadian gentleman who's wearing a quite recent Barbadian tartan that Scotland has designed for Barbados. So we are very aware of this history that we have with Scotland. My initial research really was about reading. All of my work starts with reading and writing and words. It's where I begin to sort of try to grasp some of the ideas and to understand, because my colonial education didn't have a lot of details about Scotland. We knew about indentured laborers, but there was a lot that was missing. I was very interested in learning about the clearances and learning about the practices in the Highlands with plants and healing. So this was some of the material that I was looking at. There was also a very important, this is very difficult, a book by David Dobson, who is a retired professor from St. Andrews College. His Barbados and Scotland links list the 2,500 people from Scotland that came to Barbados between the 17th and the 19th century, as well as this book, The Red Legs of Barbados, which speaks to, I don't know how to solve this problem, but it's very, okay, we have somebody in the waiting room. These very derogatory terms around the use of the word red leg that was written about by Shepherd in her book called Red Legs, and looking at things, it's a most pitiable thing to see them wandering about with some of the conceit of the white blood, but none of the energy of the European. Okay. I'm really sorry. This is a very unusual problem that I have never encountered, and I don't seem to have very good control of this. Okay, so I'm looking at what you're seeing here on the left is an image of the Scotland district in Barbados and the Scottish Highlands. I first visited Scotland in 2014, and then I really understood why it was referred to in Barbados as the Scotland district. This was a land that looked familiar to the people who had been banished or exiled, or who had chosen to come here of their own accord on a smaller scale, but these kind of scrubby low hills. And it was a very familiar, and I knew in some way that these landscapes were going to have to come together in the work that I was doing. The body of work that I ended up producing at Dundee Contemporary Arts is a limited edition box set of prints. So it sits in this cloth bound box. On the cover is what we believe from experts at the V&A Dundee is reminiscent of Ayrshire cutwork embroidery. So these traditions would have been passed down from Scotland and England to Barbados. Many women would have learned how to crochet and embroider. And so this kind of sets the tone for the body of work in terms of drawing those connections historically. This is about a 100-year-old piece of fabric that I bought at a sale in Barbados. And we then turned that into a screen print to come onto the cover of the work. And then there are these contour lines, which will come up in a later work, but they're basically stitching together the contours of Balmacara in the Highlands and the contours of the Scotland district in Barbados. I don't know how to remedy this problem. This is a map of the Scotland district in Barbados. So the contour lines were taken from here. Really sorry. This is the studio space at DCA. So, you know, just sort of beginning to work in that space and to think about images. I began to feel quite overwhelmed by all of the reading I was doing. It was such an extensive and vast history. And I then decided at one point I will put the books and the words away, and I would begin to use the images and to allow the images to begin to speak to me, and hope through this process of osmosis that what I wanted to communicate would come out as I started playing with the images. So I literally started kind of stitching these two landscapes together. I was playing also with this fishnet. And the map or the contour lines that you saw on the cover of the box are made in this kind of complicated process of cutting the shapes out of the contours, layering them on top of each other, some of the contour lines, so that when they went through the press, I mean, this is not an amazing photograph. It needs to have a rake light on it, but it's a blind embossment. And so what you're seeing is this sense of the topography, and it's called an impossible map. And I was thinking about the ways in which when people move from one place to another, especially if it's against their will, what are the ways in which they may feel a sense of connection or belonging to the new land? And that's where the word dúchas comes in, this Gaelic word that speaks to a sense of belonging to land, not through ownership, but through tradition, ritual, ecology, knowing the landscape, this very strong sort of spiritual and historic connection to a space. And I often wondered whether these people that were exiled ever felt a sense of dúchas when they came here. And I then found in some of these wills in the early 1800s, small landowners were using the term my place. And I wondered if dúchas had become my place, and if in fact they had potentially had this sense of belonging. Then I went out to the east coast of Barbados, where there's still some people who have can draw their family back to indentured labor. And I went looking for Mr. Watson, who is a fisherman and who makes fish nets. And this is called a turbot net. So I brought this with me to DCA. This is the large screen print that we burned the image onto in order to create this image, which is on a thin, beautiful red Japanese paper. And this fishnet then, well, of course, when some people were exiled off of Balmacara estate to Plockton or other coastal villages, they had to begin to develop a fishing industry. And some of the indentured laborers that would have come to Barbados would have brought their practice of fishing, as they were also living on the east coast of Barbados. And I wanted to use the fishnet as a way to kind of hold or capture the stories in the box. When the box is opened, there are 3 small boxes in it. It's a collection of 7 works or objects. These are called charms. And this is a 2nd century Chinese process where you can wet the paper, wrap it around an object, and in that way you're able to press ink onto the object so that you then retain the texture and the shape of the object underneath. And it's what the Chinese would use to preserve and create an archive of tombstones or special objects in their context. I was interested to learn that these charms were used in the Highlands by midwives. They would put these sea beans or Mary's beans, or you know, there are different names to describe them, but they come in on the world's ocean currents, and some of them come onto the coast of Scotland and some come onto the east coast of Barbados. But they were used in Scotland by midwives to put in the hands of laboring women to focus their concentration or to ease their pain. They were used as amulets. It was, the idea was that this would have some kind of healing property. But then I also learned that in reading court papers, if you were looking to accuse somebody of practicing obeah or an Afro-syncretic spiritual practice, that some of them would be using these drift beans. And so there was a similarity in the use of these organic products. I brought seaweed with me in my suitcase, and we made paper with the seaweed. I was interested in looking at how seaweed was used on both coasts. We've had this kind of ecological disaster of late, since probably 2011 or 2012, with excess sargassum coming in our coast. And I was then learning about how it was used in the Highlands for part of like lazy beds or adding more nutrition to farming, planting potatoes, and then use that paper to make a pulp. And that pulp then, that pulp was then used and pushed through a matrix that looks like a crochet pattern to become a kind of a necklace. And this piece is called a choker. So it's looking at the kinds of skills that young women were required to learn as a way to be more feminine, or what it meant to be a woman was that you had to have these particular skills. But I call it a choker because I think about the kind of violence inherent in this requirement of having to learn these particular kinds of skills. So I'm combining the paper pulp made with the seaweed and this etching of a piece of Queen Anne's lace, and the kind of harsh connection of these two materials one to the other. This is hook, round, whip, and thread worm. I've always been moved by Antonio Benitez Rojo's publication, The Repeating Island, where he speaks about Caribbean history is akin to a long annelid parasite moving through the bowels of the region. And it really speaks to the plantation as the kind of single economic model of extraction that has defined every aspect of our history and society and development. And so these are worms that would have been found in Barbados, and people would have been infected by and had to figure out ways to heal themselves. So both kind of looking at it as a metaphor for the history. It's on this perforated page, and in the back, is some gold leaf paper. So it speaks again to this, this notion of extractivism. Here is an image of these letters on slavery from William Dixon, who was Scottish, and he was a secretary to the Scottish governor Hay. And he's addressing, as you can see here, to the whites, the free Negroes of Barbados, of some Negroes eminent for their virtues and abilities. Now, while in Scotland, you are lucky in that your many of your chants and incantations have been transcribed in both Gaelic and English. In Barbados, this is not the case because it was illegal until the late 20th century. And Dr. Derek Murray, who did his PhD, shared with me these papers. And here is a notation, da for God, that is for God, as one kind of incantation. And a little further down, Dixon says he remembers an old African man saying, God in a top, God in a bottom, bless you, master. So we don't have a lot of transcription of these because this practice was oral, because it was illegal and people could be tortured, imprisoned, or put to death for practicing. Excuse me. Here are some images I've been working with, objects I collected, things that were listed again in the court material. If you wanted to accuse somebody of practicing obeah, or people that were using materials in the Highlands, could have been a glass jar with liquid, a feather, rusty nails, black thread, the knickernuts or sea beans, the hagstone, and the clay pipe in the top. So I use those images to develop another piece in the project called A Book of Charms and Incantations. This is some bark that's taken off the side of a coconut tree that connects the frond with the trunk. And it has this beautiful reminiscence of fabric. And when you open the book, it's called a flag book structure. And there's an incantation from Barbados on the left and one on the right from Scotland. And when you open it, there's this kind of, you know, these sort of flags that are printed on one side and silver on the back side of these various objects that were used both by people in the Highlands and people in Barbados. These are one of the plants that were the St. Vincent lilac that was also named after Lord Seaforth. Sorry. It's a very, okay. So another project in here is called A Book of Healing Plants. I was really interested and wondered whether people that had come from Scotland to Barbados had interfaced with enslaved society and the healers within enslaved society. This is an atlas book structure. When you open the book, these images are printed on digital prints of plantation ledger pages that I brought with me. So you would, and I was thinking about it as a kind of a workbook. So I was, you know, sticking in these kind of bookmarks with handwritten names of the plants. This particular page has bloodroot and wonder of the world on the left, nettle and West India bay leaf on the right. So the book kind of unfolds, and there are 4 pages, 2 of which are West Indian or Caribbean plants, and 2 of which are Scottish. I was particularly interested in trying to find narratives about women. And in 1661 and 1663, I learned that there were 2 ships that came in with women from the Edinburgh Correction House. Out of the 2,500 people that Dobson speaks about having come from Scotland to Barbados, 152 were women. And of that 152, about 15 were coming from the Edinburgh Correction House. Some of these names are still present here in Barbados, definitely Ramsey, Webster, Wood, Stewart. Some are less common. But I was interested in thinking about how did these women get here? And we were only able to find information on one woman. That was Margaret Ramsey. Here's an image of Annis Fitzhugh, who is the head of the DCA print studios. So I drew their names out, and they were laser engraved into a piece of plywood. And then that was inked, and that went on to this Japanese paper, where their names kind of are embedded into these two landscapes, the Scotland district of Barbados on the left and the Scottish Highlands on the right. And again, thinking about this idea of duchas, the one woman we've been able to get information about is Margaret Ramsey, and she was imprisoned for having given birth to a dead baby that she threw into the loch. And her crime was that she didn't have a woman with her at the birth. And for this crime, she was whipped in the streets of Edinburgh, and she was exiled to Barbados. Probably a young woman who would have been just already traumatized, and then thrown onto a ship of mostly men and sent to a place in the mid-17th century would have been terrifying. Other reasons for people being banished was if they interrupted a church service, if they didn't have a book of hymns in their house. And I was thinking a lot about this notion of cleaning streets of so-called immoral people, and drawing a thread to today's challenges, including Britain giving Rwanda £150 million, I think, for setting up this overseas refugee station. And then in Barbados, we have a girls' industrial school where girls are picked up off the street for wandering, which means they're usually leaving their homes because of abuse, and they're held by the state for 3 to 5 years in quite an abusive situation. And so that these connections between Scotland and Barbados, these kind of colonial practices that began hundreds of years ago there are remnants and vestiges of these notions in today's society here in Barbados. I'm going to share a little bit more about the wider project outside of the limited edition of prints. I worked with a herbalist on the Isle of Skye called Jeanette Taylor, and we collaborated on producing 3 unique teas. And these teas were made by her harvesting of foraging plants on Balmacara estate. And then we met together and spoke with students at Ploughton High School, which is on Balmacara estate. We met with crofting students. And she spoke about, the kind of first herbalist that worked on Balmacara and this long tradition of healing and working with plants. And I spoke about the way in which enslaved African society in Barbados also used plants for healing. And this combination of skills and interest as botany of resistance, ways for enslaved people to heal themselves and to have some measure of agency. We then, I worked with the students and their crofting instructor to develop a small garden using plants that grow kind of naturally in the Highlands area, and thinking about them in this sort of history and context of healing. And here are some of the students from Ploughton High School and the 4 small beds that we established. And sort of, again, drawing that parallel historically, none of these students were aware that maybe their ancestors had come out to Barbados. There was no sense of this shared history that we had. And I think, I was also trying to speak about the plot of land that Sylvia Winter speaks about within the plantation, that these marginal bits of land given to enslaved people where they would grow ground provisions and eke out a living for themselves, but it's where African traditions and spiritual practices and ritual happened in that plot, which was this pre-capitalist site of use value and community building that sat within the larger capitalist machinery of the plantation. And similarly, this is what would have happened in the Highlands, you know, people trying to have some measure of agency in their relationship to an understanding of the landscape and what grew there. And this was a couple of months after seeing some growth. And now Jeanette Taylor will go back and she will teach them how to harvest and to make teas. And so there was this kind of community educational outreach that was part of the program. I wanted to show just quickly, just checking our time, leading on from here, this is the Scotland district in Barbados on the east coast of the island. And this particular site that you're looking at was a 17th century plantation. You can see sand in the lower right corner. And that shifted from sugarcane to silica sand quarry about 60 years ago. An American man bought it and turned it into a quarry, and he died, and his son has now turned it into a permaculture and conservation site. And I was then commissioned to develop a small plot. It's called a Garden of Hope. And this is an aerial view of the garden. We just opened it on the 28th of January. This is an earthen architecture called cob, mixing soil, a very clay-like soil with hay and water to create the contours for the garden. And again, based on this idea of the plot, bringing in plants here, about 35 plants that were used specifically in enslaved society. And a lot of these plants would also have been used by women to control reproductive and post-reproductive health. So this is at the opening that we held at the end of January. And it was very important to me that we had a blessing. Irika Jelani, the woman in the green on the right, was a student of mine years ago, but she is now doing her PhD at UWI in cultural studies, and she's an elder in the Spiritual Baptist faith. And so I wanted her to bless the ground, bless the plants, bless the garden in that way that kind of invokes and brings up these traditions and Afro-syncretic spiritual traditions, and to recognize this as holy ground within a particular faith that is not the Anglican Church. And this is it in the evening. And then finally, I'll just show very quickly the most recent garden I've done, which is the one in Sharjah. I went in November with my colleague from the Netherlands who works with gardens, and we planted 150 different species of plants, again, thinking about this as a plot and a site of resistance and an agency. I brought seeds from Barbados and painted the, so frustrating. Painted the topographic lines of Walkers where I am. Sorry, I just can't seem to access that image. And then the interior space had a series of embroidered drawings. On the left here is Unlearn the Plantation, and on the right, Pray to Flowers. So it's a kind of a secular prayer. Here are the contour lines that go onto the back wall. There was a reading room of books that have been important to my own kind of development, and then including books from the Islamic world in relation to plants and how they're listed in the Quran. Yuri Guipin is the gentleman on the left, who's an artist that I worked with and brought with me into the Netherlands. And we planted everything from seed in November. And we offered a seed bank so that people could take seeds freely and start their own gardens. It was completely depleted on the opening day, and we refilled it, and it was depleted again, and we've done it a third time and it's been depleted again. And then we had a tea service, so I brought people from Iran and an indigenous artist and Yuri, and each invited them to bring their own tea recipes that we served and spoke about in the context of colonial histories, botany in the service of empire as a way to resist empire. We left it like this in November, and we came back in February, and this is what it looks like on the right. And I think that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I'll hand over to you, Alison. And you're muted.
Okay, great, fabulous. I was going to say I needed permission. Thank you. That was amazing. And it was wonderful to sort of strangely to see the materiality. So I know that one of the questions from Evie was, are those objects still inside? And I think that tells us so much about actually how the art captured the kind of materiality, so that it was impossible to know. Actually, you created that sense of the presence and absence being kind of in one moment together. So that was brilliant. Thank you so much. I've got lots I'd like to ask, but I've already said too much today. So I'm going to ask everyone, if you would put your cameras on. It would be lovely to see you. If you're more comfortable without, then obviously that's fine too. But probably if you've got your camera on, then do just literally raise your hand and we can come to you for a question. If you've got your camera off and you'd like to raise, then use the little device that we've all got used to. So I think that I saw Kirsty shoot a hand up there, if I'm right, and I'll mute myself, and Gail too. Kirsty, shall I come to you first?
Can't hear you. Not hearing you yet, Kirsty. Maybe if the host can unmute everyone and then people can manage their own muting, I wonder. It looks like you're still muted, Kirsty.
How's that now?
Yes.
Great. I think we were on a central unmuting thing. I just first of all wanted to thank you, Annalee and Alison, for the most rich and informative presentation and discussion. And to thank you both for being part of Imagine Spaces and being part of our own adventure in thinking and making, whether that's in words or in textiles or in all various forms of making, to use Alison's beautiful word, reparative responses to damaged histories, and your own beautiful word too, Annalee, that you've given us, this notion of distraction and the idea of being able to find in distraction some kind of positive outcome from narratives that are dark and fretted with trauma and violence. In your talk, Annalee, I was very taken with the responses that you yourself are making in your own art practice towards this reparation, and thinking about your work in Gaelic communities. And I was reflecting on the fact that there's so much in Gaelic culture that's about a kind of restoration and a remaking. And I'm thinking, I guess, particularly about music and in musical poetry and song, in the way that quite damaged stories are rewoven, remade into beautiful narratives that, yes, are sad and full of shadow, but nevertheless are sung in beautiful voices and to beautiful tunes. And I wonder if you might just speak for a few more, just give us a wee bit more on that kind of sense of connection that you felt when you were working over on the West Coast in those communities, drawing together those two practices. Thank you so much. It's been lovely.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I did feel, you know, walking down the streets of Dundee, where I spent some time, you know, there were also faces that looked very much like people that you would see in white Barbadian society. So that was, I was kind of struck by that. You know, it's very clear that there's this long historic connection. I was also struck by how little knowledge people had in that context of this historical connection. I really found it incredible that the curriculum, when I met with the history teacher on Plockton High School, had mentioned that the syllabus is British and it seems to be largely English, and there's not time really to speak about these kinds of connections, which is really unfortunate, but it's how the colonial project works so efficiently through the educational system and the control of curricula and textbooks. So, I mean, I was very interested in relationship to land and thinking about these common practices of learning about plants in your environment and bringing that knowledge with you, and really imagining, because we're often taught to think in Barbados that Black and white society historically were completely divided, but indentured and enslaved people would have lived in close proximity to one another and would have engaged with one another. And so I imagined that their practices of healing would have interfaced with one another. And that really is what informed the Book of Healing Plants and the Book of Charms and Incantations, and the three-dimensional charms, imagining that these people would have come together. There also was a big frustration on both sides of the pond in terms of the absence in the archive and how difficult it is to find more information about these 15 women who came from the Edinburgh Correction House, and how much digging has to be done. And I'm not an archivist, and just found, you know, and also sometimes accessing just the different language. And that is something that's shared on both sides. You know, the archives here, which are excellent in many ways and go back to the early 17th century or mid 17th century, are very much from the voice of the white male planter class. And so there were similar frustrations. And then also understanding, when coming out to Skye and being in Plockton, a lot of very similar issues today around access to housing, migration of young people, how people feel in small islands that to be successful you need to leave, foreigners coming in and buying coastal property, you know, rising values. So there were also a lot of contemporary issues that were very similar, that was really interesting. And then just the landscape. I mean, the weather is very different, of course, but the landscape, there was something very similar about the landscape.
I'm just going to jump in at this point. So I've heard parts of this talk before, Annalee, and I loved it. And, you know, it's reminded me of all the things I liked about that DCA exhibition that you put, and more, because it's made me think a little bit more. I love the attentiveness to lived experience. There's a real emphasis on living, being embodied bodies rather than just simply kind of intellectual histories. There's a real attentiveness to that histories of lived experience, but the complexities of histories, and also kind of restoring and bearing witness to lines of the past that are not actually easily visible. I loved all of that. And I was quite, part of me thinks, well, what is the function of art in this versus the function of documenting the past? And I'm trying to think about the interface between art and history writing, or art and history as documentary witness. And sometimes I think maybe the history as documentary witness just gives you a kind of the sense of the real. But what you're doing here in some ways is using art to, maybe in your fascination with ritual, magic and spiritualism, offering a kind of alternative reality to what is currently kind of accepted as the kind of day-to-day lives that we are all part of. And is this part of a kind of restorative, reparative kind of aesthetic, so that art needs to enchant in order to give us something else? Art needs to give us wonder. I mean, something that's really missing in documenting is that sense of wonder.
I mean, I guess the difference really is between the historian and the artist is the role of the imagination. So we have the freedom to play in a way that I guess historians don't really. And I guess I think a lot about empathy, you know, the potential of writing and music and art in general to make people feel. And so the idea is that hopefully the work will resonate at this embodied level where, you know, it's beyond language. And, you know, this was the challenge in the process when I had been reading this material and speaking with people and doing the research and going into the archives. And then just at one point, I just very distinctly remember saying, okay, all the words need to leave. I need to summon the images. This needs to come up because I can't deal with the words anymore. It's too much. I now need to deal with images. And there's something about the power of imagery that allows us all to access it differently as well. So there's not a single right way to read the work, but hopefully there will be multiple narratives and readings and ways to respond to the work. And I guess hopefully it's to just also create more interest in this shared history, and that it might interest people in looking into that history a bit more. Because I think what the Facing Our Past project is trying to do is laudable. But there is also a sense in Scotland that it wasn't us. You know, there's a sense that everything happened in England, when in actual fact, when you look at the payout for the planters, Scotland actually got more money than England per capita. So I think it's also an attempt to redress some of the fallacies around the way that history has been narrated, and to have a sense of empathy and curiosity through the body of work.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to shut up. Got more questions, but I'm just going to shut up. I'm not sure how to unmute.
People can't unmute for some reason. Yeah. Everybody's saying in the chat, I don't know if everyone can be unmuted, Gail, because I feel like everybody's muted. So if everyone can be unmuted, then they can manage their own microphone.
Brilliant. I think the problem is once anyone mutes, you won't be able to unmute again. I think we're on a glitchy Zoom, unfortunately. So we'll all just be quiet, and I think we should keep our mics going. So
good idea.
I'm going to invite anybody who I can see to just literally put up their hand if they'd like to. Beverly, I can see your both versions of the hand are up. Lovely.
Okay. I found the talk really interesting, but one of the things, because my research started off by looking at the Windrush generation and their descendants. And then I realized, there's actually quite a lot of people who are doing this. So I'm still looking at the Black experience, but using autoethnographic approach to it as a methodology. However, one of the things I came across, which I don't think is said enough, we talk about, yes, this organization and that organization benefited from slavery, from the slave trade, etc. But we never actually talk about the ordinary people of this country that also benefited. And maybe they didn't have big lands, and maybe they don't have museums, but they were still benefiting it. It's like buying shares, stocks and shares. Even if you're not rich, you can still buy stocks and shares. And I think that has a legacy, and we see that. I think we see it playing out, because slavery doesn't only impact a Black person's life, but it impacts also, as D'Angelo says, how white people view Black people. And this is ordinary, because a lot of us as Black people are not going to maybe come across white landowners or museums, but we're going to come across ordinary white people, and they don't understand. It looks like slavery is something that was done in a distance, when no, ordinary people was also profiting from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that, you know, I often felt that in when I was spending time in Scotland, that there's such a disparity in terms of general knowledge about this. So whereas in the Caribbean, we've been writing about our history in terms of race and class and economics since the 20s or 30s, it's much more recent in the UK. And I think there's still so much work to be done for this to kind of enter into the larger, wider national consciousness. So there's, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's such a long and layered and complex history that there is so much work to be done. So it's good that you're doing the work as well, because it just needs to be unpacked by so many people in so many ways. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. And I love Barbados, by the way. Although I'm a Jamaican, I love Barbados.
The two are not mutually exclusive.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Beverly. Ellie, I think that your hand was next. Can you ask your question?
Oh, I managed to unmute. Yeah, I had a question, but thanks, Beverly. That was really useful insight and something I'm thinking through. Kind of, yeah, that sort of struck me a bit of my writing. I've been looking into my ancestry, and it's not actually to do with slavery, but shares in different mines and that kind of thing. It's been uncovered in my own family tree, and that's definitely something I'm sort of trying to process through writing, I guess. So yeah, that was cool. Thank you. My question, I guess, ties into that, is about you're obviously showing your work in lots of really different contexts, and I'm really interested in sort of how different audiences respond to it, and sort of how that interacts with potentially your hopes for the project and the work that you do. How the work is landing and discussions that are coming from that.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So when the work was shown in Balmacara, it was important to me that it was shown there. It's not a very fancy contemporary art gallery, but it's within the community that the work comes out of. And, you know, it was important to me that there were a number of public conversations around that work. So there was one conversation at Skybridge Studios with Ian McKinnon, who has been writing and doing some writing for the National Trust about the history of some of these particular properties. So that was a way to really open out to the community there and to share the work. Some people have greater or lesser degrees of knowledge, and the discussions after were always really robust. Engaging with students at Plockton High School was really important, and doing that over a number of times, growing the garden, having conversations about the plants, presenting the work to the students. And then when it goes to the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh, the curator there, Emma Nicholson, you know, her job as the curator will be to establish a context for that as part of the exhibition. You know, showing in Sharjah at the moment is also really interesting, a very different environment. They abolished slavery in 1963. I thought it was a typo. Kind of hard to imagine that this is actually a true fact. So very different kinds of conversations happening there. So I do feel when I show the work, I write about it, I tend to try and develop programming around it. That's part of why we do the teas, this speaking back to the British tradition of drinking tea, which was a blood sweetened beverage that was grown on plantations in China and sweetened with sugar in the West Indies. And what I'm doing is offering this kind of reparative tea that is a healing tea with plants. And then we serve the tea as a moment to pause, exhale, slow down, and have these kind of slower, deeper conversations. So I'm very aware. I mean, I've done curatorial work in the Netherlands. Their work in Black studies is almost negligible, and they know very little about their colonial history. So I do feel that having this wider programming, there were a number of public discourses at the Edinburgh's, I think, I can't remember, like Environment Climate House. We had some in Devon projects. So there's always, I think, this supportive environment around the work to engage in discussion that allows the work to open up and unfold with people in those communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Susan. Thanks. Do you want to ask your question?
Hi there. Thanks very much, everyone. Annalee, it was really interesting. And of course, as a geographer, I'm always excited when I see contour lines. I need to do something like that at home now. I think there's so many different components to this, which I think is what does kind of inspire this real kind of innovation in terms of thinking about how we connect the historical landscape to the present. And you said something that really struck me around looking at these materials that you were sort of, bringing into your work and bringing into the art and kind of recreating as well. When you said some of the materials, that there was a reminiscence of fabric, and I jotted that down because I just thought it really captured this notion of both the material but also the connection to the past through remembering and through memory. And I wondered if you could talk a wee bit, I know you have also included that in what you've been talking about, but in terms of how the role of memory has sort of filtered through your work as well, and what opportunities that offers in terms of connections, but also what challenges having to negotiate memories and the way in which landscapes are remembered or misremembered, and how you work your way through that through your projects. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, there are a lot of challenges in terms of negotiating memory. I'm going to just share, there's a really great book that I'm enjoying at the moment called Decolonial Ecology by Malcolm Ferdinand, and he's a Martinican scholar, and he's writing about the environment and the environmental crisis from the perspective of the Caribbean. And I think one of the challenges here is there has been such a profound erasure that the landscape has become what he calls the fatherland. The motherland has been lost. So in your culture, assuming you're in Scotland, I mean, I could go back and find hundreds of years of the transcription of the charms and incantations, which is like such an incredible blessing. And so much has been erased. So I think that there's a challenge in our part of the world. I mean, our archives go back to 1648, but as I said, they're a very particular kind of information. I'm really sorry that the cockerel has decided to rock up at this time. But yeah, there's, I'm really interested in finding ways to develop a more intimate relationship with this landscape that, as I've said and written about, has been mediated for centuries by the plantation. And it's a kind of an intimidating thing to do because the plantation is now also being replaced by tourism. And there is a history, but it's buried. And so one of the ways I think about trying to negotiate memory, or the lack of memory that we have access to, is through this ritual of walking and moving my body through this particular landscape and trying to, to question, can we know a land through the wind, through the breeze? And also when I walk, I'm finding literal material remains from the late 17 and early 1800s. The landscape here, there's there's both a slaughterhouse that sits below the surface of the soil, and there's also this material culture that I find every day when I walk, which are porcelain and clay shards that are from the late 17, early 1800s. And so I've worked with some of those material remains. I work with an archaeologist for the last 6 or 7 years. We have a summer fields session here every summer. We've done about 100 or 200 digs. We have about 5,000 material pieces that are documented and sit in the museum. So I think the negotiation of memory is about working with the land in multiple ways through this shared archaeological visual art project, through writing, through making the work, through the setting up of Fresh Milk, which is like this cultural plant that I've intervened onto the site of a former plantation that houses a small library of 3,500 books that is specifically a counter to the plantation house that would have had bars with rum. They didn't have libraries, they didn't collect art. So it's really trying to think about memory and shifting ground by shifting the activity that happens on the ground, by making art, by building community, hosting residents, having a reading room, you know, working with students to do the digs. So I guess that's those are some of the ways in which I negotiate memory, and then trying to understand how I've been so, you know, the plantation sits within me. I was raised on a plantation. My father was a planter. I've been reckoning with it my whole life, and understanding how colonial my education is and trying to re-educate myself and to understand more about the influence of Africa on this place, and really trying to reckon with that in honest ways. So that's, yeah, I think that's the weaving together of all of these things in some way.
Thank you. Thanks. That's really interesting.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Annalee. I'm aware we haven't got much time left, so I was just going to ask if there's anyone who would like to ask a question who hasn't asked one before. Catherine, I can see you've put a comment in there. Do you want to talk to it or just leave it in the chat?
I'm quite happy just to leave it. It was just a wee explanation of the word doerchas. It's something, I mean, I've spoken to Annalee about this before. It's one of these Gaelic words that I still figure out when I'm sitting with it, and this word can quite often explain where I am with my own identity in Scotland. So I'm from the Isle of Skye. I'm from a very old Gael background. I don't speak the language that I should speak because of colonization. So I'm kind of in this, how would I word it? I kind of come from people that were internally displaced. So instead of being sent to colonies, we were displaced within our own ground, and then fought back and basically fought the British government for a while and changed land laws in Scotland back in the 1880s. So I still like this kind of word and what it means, and me kind of learning about my own culture, but also the impact that we've had in other cultures, and spending time with Annalee and recently with another artist, Holly. It's been really helpful to unpick this, but also the mirroring of our archives. I'm an archivist. The gaps of my own culture and identity and history that are there are probably mirroring what we're seeing in Barbados and other parts. And it is that kind of education is very much under the Union Jack and Empire, but we are working at unstitching it and doing work with youth groups, and art especially I find is an absolute amazing way to reimagine the future, but also look at the past, and it makes it very accessible. But yeah, I just wanted to share that, and that's a wee rant for you all. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Annalee. It's been really good to see how things have gone.
So nice to see you.
No, and thank you, because I think it really adds, I mean, one of the kind of ethical calls of this work is for connection. It is for that sense of like not being determined entirely by that history and by acts of dispossession, but to be able to kind of connect and collaborate. So that's a brilliant contribution. Thank you so much. I can see that Evie or Evie is asking, are those objects still inside the paper charms? So
Yeah, no, they're not. So that's the beauty of that the Takahan method, is that you wet the paper, you put it on the object, you create this kind of, it's like a tampon. It's cotton that's covered in fabric. You press it into ink, and then you put it onto the paper, and wait for that paper to dry, remove the object, and it leaves this kind of, I guess, a kind of a ghostly, but it's an impression or a record or an archive of the object. So no, they're absolutely removed. So they're kind of fragile, but they hold their shape and they're really beautiful. It's a beautiful process for doing that. And if I could, Alison, the book about the fatherland, it's called Decolonial Ecology, and the author is Malcolm Ferdinand. It's spectacular. I'm loving it. And there are lots of YouTube. He's done a lot of YouTube lectures on his work and his thinking. But I also, somebody has said something about the contour lines. And what I'm thinking about there is, you know, Barbados has been very heavily mapped from the 17th century. And there are these maps of the soil of the island. I mean, every square foot of soil, so that when the different varieties of sugarcane were bred, you would plant a particular variety in St. Philip because it was drier than you would in St. George, where the soil is more fertile. And so the mapping, of course, was for these extractivist purposes within the plantation. But what I'm trying to do is to think about the contour lines that have shaped my life and to imagine them in a more poetic kind of way. So I know with the lines on the wall behind me, I know where the gully is to the east of Walker's, where it meets Jordan, and I know where my home is in my studio. So it's this way of trying to understand the land in a more kind of poetic and a non-extractive kind of way.
Thank you. I think we really are coming to the end. I just want to acknowledge Malika's put a note in the chat saying that she's found this inspirational as a writer. Great to have you here, Malika, and thank you for that. I mean, I guess, you know, Gail's question, to come back to that about what is distinctive about the artistic project. And I guess, you know, facing the past is very much, in some sense, just being able to have calm, evidence-based conversations about that history. But the artistic, we've just said, haven't we, the artistic makes you not be able to you know, it really genuinely helps you to have presence of absence. It helps you to understand what's not there. It helps you to kind of imagine, you know, how not just, you know, I love when you say about that rewalking, but also it's almost like in that you can imagine those who've walked there before you, who had all kinds of, you know, different relationships to that land as well. It's a kind of opportunity or an invitation to kind of refuse that overdetermination, isn't it, of that one narrative. So it seems to me that your practice is so, it leaves space for others deliberately. You know, there's always that space, and you know, I know that for you the conversation is how the art is kind of alive in the world. It's not, you know, it's kind of deliberately unfinished in that sense, that it needs to be discussed, to be
right,
to be realized.
Yeah, it needs an audience to be fulfilled and completed. Yeah.
So it's been really magical to have that opportunity to be part of this today, and hopefully to bring that work you know, to life through your interpretation, and also everybody's here, which has been wonderful. So, you know, just leaves to me, I think, to say a big thank you for those of us who are on screen, to have a big round of applause to all of you for being here and sharing this. A special thank you to Annalee for sharing her work, and to Gail and Kirsty. I think Kirsty somehow is on the other side of the chat room now. But despite all of the glitches, I think it's been a fabulous session. So thank you, you know, and we have really imagined. So I think hopefully we've lived up, Gail, to your hopes for this kind of event, and it's been a pleasure to be in your imagined space.
Thanks,
Thank you, Alison. It's been a real pleasure having these kinds of conversations. When we started this whole enterprise, we just thought that, you know, we'll see what happens to it. and some sessions have worked much better than others, but this has been such a lively session. So thank you so much, both Alison and Annalee, for this.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
I'm just